Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back for those of you who've already here. Anyone joining us online, welcome as well. My name is Andrew Burridge. I'm at Macquarie University and I'm chairing the session today. I'm vastly unorganised, which will become pretty apparent. So let me just bring up a few things. I think before we go any further, I'd like to firstly acknowledge, of course, that we are meeting on the unceded lands here at University of Melbourne of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. And so this is, of course, vital that we acknowledge where we're meeting today. And I recognise, of course, that many will be joining online. So, of course, you may reflect upon where you're joining us from today. This session is titled Spatiality, Care and Control, number 1. I think number 2 is this afternoon, in which I'm presenting it. And the subtitle is Beyond Prison. And certainly importantly, this morning, we heard from some of our speakers talking about what we might call the carceral creep. And certainly we can think about the ways in which the prison and spaces of incarceration go well beyond certainly the more traditional spaces or those purpose-built spaces of incarceration. We have 4 speakers, although we may be missing one at the moment. So we'll see how we go. Generally, we have 15 minutes for each speaker. We'll take Q&A directly after each paper, and then hopefully, I'm certain we'll have more time to come back as well. We've just been joined by the royalty that is Claire London, the organizer. Thank you, Claire, for everything. It's been a really wonderful day and so far, and so I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers. Don't want to take up too much more time. Jessica Collins is our first speaker today. And just to acknowledge those who are joining online, we have a wonderful support team here. So please, if you've got questions, you're welcome just to pop them in the chat or otherwise raise your hand online and we'll make sure we get to you as well. There's a bit of Macquarie pride here. I'm at Macquarie University. Jess is at Macquarie, but I didn't choose for Jess to go first. But Jess Collins will be presenting on the camp as a custodian institution, the case on, I knew I shouldn't read it out because I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to hand over to you. No, my Serbian is terrible, so I'm going to hand over to Jess. Thanks very much, Jess.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. Let me just test if it works. No. Good. Unless I should point somewhere else. Unless I'm incompetent at technology. Possible I've not pressed something. If you want, I can just like I can do it for you. I just got it. I'm gonna take it. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So today I'm presenting a paper called The Camp as a Custodian Institution, the case of Krnjača Asylum Centre in Belgrade, Serbia. And this paper is a paper for a journal as well as a chapter within my thesis and part of my broader PhD project on the archipelago of institutional refugee camps in Serbia along the Balkan route. Within the PhD project, I look at how this archipelago functions to support a corridor of migration, specifically an informal corridor, using the perspectives of both the authorities as well as the refugees and residents of these camps themselves. What I'm presenting today is this paper that I've co-authored with my supervisors, Claudio Minca and Richard Carter-White. And I'm really also looking for feedback on this concept more broadly of a custodian institution. So next slide. How does it work? Thank you. So this project has focused on the rise of institutional refugee camps in Serbia since the start of the so-called refugee crisis in the summer of 2015 in Europe. From this summer to the spring of 2016, a period of a humanitarian corridor existed across the Balkan route. And during this time, nearly 1 million refugees were supported across borders via the informal systems of transport until they reached their desired destination countries in Western Europe. However, in March of 2016, the borders along the Balkan route rapidly shut following a domino effect of closures. However, Serbia never closed its borders, and it subsequently became the bottleneck of the Balkan route, with thousands of refugees becoming stuck within the country at a given point in time. With a lack of legal pathways to reach the European Union, refugees have been left with one option: to attempt to cross these borders informally. And what they've termed these border crossings as is the game. However, as borders have become increasingly more violent and patrolled, people remain stuck in Serbia for lengthier and lengthier periods of time, sometimes for months up until years. Since 2016, there have been between 4,000 and 9,000 refugees registered within the country. However, the number of refugees thought to be in the country is actually much higher. Those that are registered are living within those institutional camps. However, there are also those that are living in the border regions and living in makeshift spaces. Most NGOs estimate that this number is probably 2,000 or 3,000 people higher than the registered number. And despite the increase in border restrictions, thousands of refugees continue to cross in and out of the country each month. Okay, great. To support these refugees, an archipelago of camps has formed across the country. And this map is maybe a little dated and a little small, but there are about 21 camps now throughout the country. But what this map really represents, if you can just even see the little dot points, is how dispersed these camps are throughout the country. And this archipelago has been formed to provide accommodation to refugees and asylum seekers in Serbia. Using a camp studies and camp geographies lens, this paper seeks to understand one specific scale of analysis in understanding how the archipelago of camps functions to both enable and prevent mobility along the route. We do this by investigating the camp itself and its role as an institution. To understand the varied logics and manifestations of the camp, care and control are two concepts frequently invoked within camp studies, as is indicated by the very name of this session. Less often, the term custody is utilized within the refugee camp context to understand these spaces. This paper attempts to build on this literature by proposing a renewed focus on the idea of custodianship, with the hope that custodianship may be a useful tool to encompass the varying and seemingly contradictory logics of the camp. Yeah, great. We propose the notion of the camp as a custodian institution, that is, a sovereign authority whose biopolitical interventions imply both the preservation and the curtailment of life. In my attempts to conceptualize the camp in the context of Serbia, and specifically along an informal migration corridor, I struggled to distinguish between care and control within the camp context, as care often manifested into control and vice versa. Originally, this paper was titled Care, Custody, and Control within Krnjača Camp, and then completely started to shift. Contrastingly, the use of the term custodian provided an effective means of apprehending the complex nature of the camp governance, and in particular, the shifting intensity of power relations between management and camp residents. Today, I'll focus on the empirical findings of Krnjača in relation to the concept of custodianship, and how this term can be used in understanding seemingly distinct and even contradictory modes of camp governance as part of a single coherent regime of power. These findings illustrate the range of forms that custodianship has taken on within a single camp, from the imposition and negation and negotiation of everyday rules and regulations to the strict containment measures put into place during COVID-19. Thank you. So custodianship in Krnjača camp has manifested as regulation, and I'm just presenting here today 3 examples of how custodianship may be able to manifest, and this is not to say that these are the only ways in which they manifest. But we've seen it manifest in this particular case study in regulation through the imposition of a series of socio-spatial distinctions and rules that regulate the everyday conduct, possessions, activities, and mobility of its residents. These regulations were very often cited within interviews with camp residents when asked about their daily lives. Here, I very briefly explored two elements of how this is manifested as regulation. On the one hand, through the spatial organization of the camp itself and its infrastructure, and on the other, through camp management and the imposition of curfews. Krnjača is situated on the outskirts of Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. It consists of a number of barracks, about 16, which house designated demographics of refugees. So from single men to families, single women who are sometimes with families, unaccompanied children who should have their own barrack, but sometimes they don't, and they're also put with families. So all of these spaces are controlled and regulated in one way or another. Most barracks also contain a recreational or educational space for residents to gather and receive support, with some spaces being solely designated for women or children and others being more flexible and also which allow single men. In a conversation with the commissariat about these spaces, and the commissariat is the governing body of refugee camps in the country, the commissariat stated that we give them an opportunity to spend this time with us. No matter whether they're going to stay here in Serbia or move on, the opportunity to learn and get a certificate that they could use to get employed in Serbia or elsewhere is here. So here you see photos of a sewing center in the camp, which is mostly they call it the women's corner. It's a female space. And then on the right-hand side, it's a photo of a child's classroom within the camp, which is a standalone kind of makeshift building, but which looks very new and nice. But in doing so, though, they regulate these spaces of support. Who can use them? Sometimes women, sometimes men, other spaces just for children, and mostly just for children. What I'm doing wrong with that. So while the regulation of these spaces is on the one hand used to support its residents in one way or another, and at the same time is used to manage how they may or may not use the spaces within the camp. The following is an excerpt of a notice seen during the tour of the camp in August of this year. And what this basically says is when residents may be able to come or go from the camp and whether or not they're allowed to consume alcohol or narcotics within the space. While frustrating to camp residents, particularly the rules around curfews and when they're allowed to come and go, and a perpetual reminder of their lack of autonomy within the camp, these rules and regulations are seen by the management as a necessary tool to maintain order and safety. Without the designation of space to certain demographics and activities, or the restrictions on curfew and contraband items such as alcohol, various risks could be posed to individual residents. I wonder in these instances, could it be argued that custodianship has manifested as a kind of parental regulation, in which limits are placed on the everyday life of residents for their own protection, according to the commissariat? At the same time, there is a revealing inconsistency in the ways in which these limits are enforced.
I think it goes.
Okay. Can we go back a couple slides? One more? Yeah, there we go. So what has become evident over the course of our interviews was the leniency that was also afforded to refugee residents through the management's approach to resident mobility, as well as within the materiality of the camp itself. Camp management often demonstrated a willingness to ignore certain breaches in camp rules or to otherwise allow a level of flexibility that seemed at odds with the regulatory system I've just described. This more relaxed form of custodianship partly reflects the range of political imperatives in which the camp is implicated. While Krnjača has the responsibility to ensure the safety and order of its residents, there is also recognition of the desire of many residents to remain on the move, which also happens to align with the broader political pressures within Serbia itself to dissuade refugees from remaining in the country, even if this might contrast with what the European Union wants. In an interview with the commissariat, when asked about the freedom of mobility, they stated, "They can be absent during the night, but we have to know they will come back. So if they're having dinner at a friend's place in the city or they're at a restaurant, it's desirable that they tell us they won't be here for the evening count, just so we wouldn't remove them from the list. They're free to go." And then she says, "I understand their desire and their need to simply disappear overnight if they find a way to leave Serbia illegally." And this is what they're referring to as the aforementioned game. So it's well known, it's well stated within interviews with the commissariat and talks with refugees that people are going for gain. They don't want to stay in the country, and really nor does Serbia want them to stay in the country. Camp residents echoed this, and nearly all respondents detailed how they or those they knew were always allowed to return to the camp after their failed attempts at the game, where they often failed multiple times before actually successfully crossing the border, or for other reasons, as long as they were only gone for a few days. Whilst this selective attitude to curfew represents a kind of temporal leniency, the material border of the camp was also the site of some literal breaches due to the structural nature of an open camp. Whilst Krnjača has a fence around its perimeter and a gate at its entrance, the fence does not reach unreachable heights, and there's no barbed wire at its peak. Therefore, residents can often enter and exit the camp without notice by residents during times of curfew, or without notice by management, which means that residents can also bring items, so contraband items such as fans or heaters, into the camp without notice, as well as people. Effectively, by relaxing and mitigating the enforcement of some of its own rules to meet the need of mobility, camp management indirectly but effectively supports the mobility of those residents who intend to move further along their informal journeys. Additionally, this more lenient manifestation of custodianship ultimately serves the very regulatory system that it seemingly undermines by providing a sort of pressure release that makes it possible for individuals to accept and live with the strict regulations for months or even years that comes with living in a camp. I will now briefly turn towards what has been the most extreme manifestation of custodianship within the camp, and that is during the events that occurred during the start of the pandemic. In May of 2020, as the cases began to arise in Serbia, the whole country went into lockdown, as did the camps. So there were very strict measures in Serbia, even for citizens, where they were only allowed to exit their homes for certain times of the day, but where camp residents were not allowed to exit their homes at all. So what was also done was that about the 3,000 people that were living in makeshift camps, they were forcibly also moved into the camps during this time. And we saw this extreme manifestation of control. And while some of the measures undertaken by the camp and the Serbian government were understandable due to the exceptional circumstances produced by the pandemic and not significantly different from those taken by other countries across Europe, what these measures illustrate is how, under political circumstances that seem to warrant it, camp custodianship can suddenly manifest into a severe form that places exceptional restrictions on its residents. All leniency may in fact be set aside under specific circumstances when custodianship reveals its extraordinary capacity to contain, suspend, and diminish life, much like what Agamben spoke about. Thus, in times of emergency, the case of Krnjača confirms that, after all, a camp always remains a camp. That is, a spatial political technology that radically puts the judicial status and the right to mobility of selected populations into question. So, in conclusion, we argue that Krnjača camp demonstrates just a few of the multiple manifestations of custodianship that are possible within a refugee camp, particularly along an informal migration corridor. For even when camps are created to provide protection and humanitarian support to vulnerable populations, they often still operate as technologies within broader political contexts. And just to mention that this paper did get published 2 days ago, surprisingly. So if you're interested in reading it, I can send you the link if you don't have access, or there's a screenshot. Next slide. Yeah. But I also really, like I said at the beginning, would appreciate any feedback as I kind of try and work what is this paper into my broader thesis, and how it all kind of connects to this idea of the archipelago and this conceptualization of custodianship. So thank you.
5 more seconds to spare.
Oh, wow. I thought it was going to be way over.
So we're going to take questions. If you do have a question, we'll have a mic, and of course, mine as well.
Thanks, Jess. Really interesting. I guess thinking through the concept of custodian institution, I think you've made a really, really compelling case for the custodianship half. I'm curious about the institution half, and maybe you could speak to that through the.
People online cannot.
Oh, sorry, that's try a different one. Check. That one's better, maybe. the illegality of the game, so to speak, whose laws are rendering that illegal, and so which laws are the institution of the camps following? Is that a EU restriction? Is it Serbian? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the illegality of the game would come into just the oh my gosh, I can't say that word, illegality of crossing borders informally, and without a passport and without going through border controls. And that's something with the border externalization that we're increasingly seeing in the Balkans, especially along Serbia and Bosnia's borders. With Frontex now being deployed to these borders, that is what really makes it illegal. However, for Serbia and from the Serbian perspective, and especially the Commissariat for Refugees that manages these camps, Serbia, I mean, there are a lot of politics here. Serbia is not an economically prosperous country, and they don't have the ability, this would be the Serbian perspective, to house these people and to accommodate these people. And so they want them to go. You won't see Serbian police at the borders very often. You sometimes will see in the media a bit of posturing of, oh, we're rounding up refugees and we're putting them into the camp. And it's kind of just to show that we're doing something, as local populations may start to get frustrated in some regions of the country. But yeah, so I think, I guess what we're seeing is this kind of this camp system that is formed as a way of kind of managing this mobility to an extent. So while people are saving money to pay the smugglers to take them across borders, or if people have a health condition and they can't continue the journey any longer, it's giving them a space to pause. But it's not a space where they're truly probably going to get asylum. I think there's only 20 asylum applications approved a year in Serbia. It's very, very small. So this system along this informal corridor, I think, is supporting refugees in a very interesting and unique ways. And I'd be curious along other informal corridors if there are similarities. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jess?
Just had a comment on Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic presentation and looking forward to reading the paper.
Excellent.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That was really great. And yeah, look forward to seeing the article. I'm just really interested in what you were saying about the way that those in these camps are kind of let out enough so that they can endure actually longer of the containment. I find that really interesting and obviously disturbing. And I wondered if you're thinking of looking into that as a practice of control, even though it might appear to be, caring for people in some way or giving them an opportunity to have some autonomy.
I think this is why I really struggled when I tried to position this paper within control and a care framework. I didn't know what belonged in care and what belonged into control. And this is why I was like, well, I'm just going to go with something new and just not use those two terms. So it was kind of a challenge also to myself to try not to use those. But I think absolutely, we kind of conceptualized it as pressure release, because without this ability to remain mobile, people might go into spaces, go into makeshift spaces that they didn't want them in the country. And so this is a way of controlling people, of saying, hey, we're giving you a place to live outside of society, on the peripheries of the country, in cities that aren't so prosperous. I mean, some of these camps, I didn't get to do as much research as I wanted on the ground because of the pandemic. But some of these camps are in really, really isolated places. And yeah, it's to the country's benefit ultimately, and absolutely is a way to control them. And I would love to kind of do more work on the ground and talk to more people, especially in these camps outside of the capital city. Because being able to come and go when you live in Belgrade is a very different experience than if you live, on the border in the south of the country. Thank you.
It was but you gave very good time.
Thanks. I wondered whether, if it's like
the camps are situated in the broader regime, and maybe just thinking in terms of the EU or only in terms of Serbia, what are the economic interests that are connected with it? Or you already got into it, but maybe could you elaborate a bit more on that? And are they related to the border violence of like Serbian right-wing groups or not? And then you said that the camps are biopolitical institutions, nevertheless, for the preservation and or the containment of life. And if some of these moments, they rather seem to be like the corridors or part of the corridors, and saying like, okay, we don't want to preserve or contain life, we just want to channel it through as fast as it's possible. So is this still custodianship, or is it rather looking away and not being a custodian at all?
Sure. Sorry, I remember. Okay, so regarding the economic point, this is something that is definitely present, but I haven't had the capacity to research as much as I would like. I have always suspected that there is an economic benefit for Serbia to house and accommodate refugees. Before this refugee crisis, so-called refugee crisis started, I think there were 2 or 3 camps open throughout the country. Now there are 21. The commissariat now employs so many more people because of this regime that's come into existence. And, you know, employment is a huge issue within Serbia. And so I really do wonder how much the government has gotten, how many more jobs has this created, and is there like a slight economic benefit? At the same time, when I was just back in Serbia this past August, there are now so many help wanted signs throughout the country in terms of staff needed. And now, because of a whole nother wave of kind of refugees that have come through from Burundi that truly do want asylum in the country, people are hiring these people to work in the country. And there's a lot of Serbians that want people to stay because they need employees and they're facing brain drain. So I think there's definitely an economic element to this. It's definitely not fully part of my scope in my project. In terms of how the camp interacts with the border regime, I can't remember your full question.
Related to these right-wing.
Oh, the right-wing groups. Yeah, I mean, so you see the right-wing groups far more within makeshift spaces. And there were some examples of right-wing groups like once ramming a car into the gates of a camp, but these right-wing groups are much more present in the city spaces and in the makeshift spaces, so hasn't come as much into play. And even when I've asked this question in interviews, even NGOs have kind of thrown this off and said it's the media, it doesn't happen that much, it's the media kind of perpetrating this more so. And then this idea of, or this question of, is the camp really a custodian if they want people to move through? I think yes, because even if it is for a temporary period of time, this temporary period of time can last for years. And because of that, I think for whatever, even if it's for days, for whatever span of time, I think they are in a sort of custody of the camp. They leave the camp and they still have to think about the camp. When they're going on game, they have to think, if I want that bed, I have to be back in 2 to 3 days. So this camp has a lasting impact and effect on their journey and their mobility. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Jess, and we may well have time to come back. So if you have any other questions or they pop up, certainly share them. So our second speaker, it appears is not here. So unless I'm mistaken, we'll move on for the moment. So we'll move on to Julia Manek, who's visiting from Frankfurt, from Goethe University, and so I'm going to hand over to Julia and 15 minutes or so, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks, Claire, also for the organization. Incredible for that, incredible organization, and also care already before the conference. Well, okay, hello, thank you for being here. This presentation is part of activist research situated somewhere between feminist human geography, clinical psychology. It's my PhD, but it's not a single woman project, but based on the work of many, so like different groups and actors. And well, actually, this morning I thought when I listened to Debbie and Ted, I thought, okay, everything is just sad. I can go home, but I didn't. But maybe you will just kind of rehear some of their ideas. So in this presentation, I will share, countermappings, testimonies of Samos hotspot camps as exemplary for the construction of harmful spaces that target people on the move and oscillate between open access versus confinement. So they are exemplary also for the EU border regime on the 5 Aegean islands, where new facilities have been built that replace the old dehumanizing camps. And Samos maybe is not known so well. Lesbos, notorious Camp Moria is, and it's kind of the bigger brother or sister of Samos camp. So a teaser, quoting Tab, it's about gorilla and lipstick. So, okay, what am I going to do in the next 15 or 17 minutes? Is first a bit of storytelling. I'm sorry, I mean, this presentation works with a lot of visual keys. I hope it, well, anyways. So storytelling, the transition from the RIC, which is a reception and identification center, to an MPRIC, which is a multi-purpose reception and identification center. From open access to confinement, ? And the second is the research question of the countermapping. If and or how can these camps, the RIC and the supposed MPRIC, how they are produced as torturing environments and spaces of uncare. And now you might ask, what is a torturing environment? And I try to explain that, I'm sorry. Okay, now. Anyways, so now the presentation is not relevant, but okay, a torturing environment. According to the Convention Against Torture, the CAT, which already was like referred to in the morning. Could you just blend the screen? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Andrew. According to the CAT, torture is the intentional infliction of severe pain or severe suffering on a powerless victim who is usually a detainee for a specific purpose, which is the extraction of a confession or information, or else their intimidation or punishment. And most important for us today is that it's committed by a public official. But what if the infliction of suffering is not committed by a public official, but caused by the architecture, the infrastructure, or environmental or spatial conditions of a detention center? So this could be a torturing environment. And per definition, a torturing environment emerges when the cumulative effect of the combination of techniques come together that harm a person substantially, producing either physical or psychological suffering, and they are intentionally produced or due to the direct state responsibility for the existence of these conditions. Okay, so this said, we're coming to the countermappings. Before September 2021, thousands of illegalized people on the move resided in the so-called RIC, which is glued to the hillside of, and I also to the hillside of the city of Vathi. And so the camp is now named the Old Camp. It looks like the RIC, the Old Camp, started operating in 2016. It always had a narrative of misery due to massive and continued overpopulation, with a peak in 2019 with 6,000 residents and having a capacity of 650 people. And although people could move around freely in the city of Vathi, most were stuck in the openly dehumanizing camp conditions. So the new camp is is remote in the middle of the island. And it has got a story of a costly but humanitarianly perfect new camp. And the discourse was dominated by quotes like those of EU Commissioner Ylva Johansson, who was saying, new reception centers will not be closed, they will be humane. And this is all about people and their basic rights to feel safe. So let's have a look at the new camp. We can see what Lauren Martin and Matthew Mitchelson would call detached geographies. It's remote, it's securitized. This is like just standing before the barbed wire. And one day before the opening, the entrance gate received a new sign, which did it say MPRIC? No, it said CCAC, Closed Controlled Access Center. So now this is the scenario we investigated via a lot of methods, which I will just skip for like the sake of completeness. I just kind of show them to you. But yeah, we used interview semi-structured. We used granular theory and the torturing environment scale, which is a validated scale used in different contexts. And although the term environment suggests a form on focus on measurable environmental conditions, the concept also expands on the lived experience, of carceral space as socially constructed and embodied. So we have there 6 subscales out of 8 that apply in the case of Samos, and we will come back to that scale later. Now the countermappings are inspired by feminist and critical cartographies. They aim at visibilizing and understanding spatial control as well as its contestations. It's work in progress, different modus operandi with color codes that indicate emotions and or physical feelings, and icons kind of indicating different events. And so work in progress since 2018. The icon for a quarantine, for instance, is now new for the pandemic. The mappings of the old camps look like that. I kind of try to systematize them a bit more. This map is from the Samos Advocacy Collective. The colors are purple for disgust, orange for unsafety, and blue and yellow for extreme temperatures of heat and cold and or humidity. And we see colors and codes all over except for green, which would have been safety. And what we can see here is some surveillance cams, barbed wire surrounding the camp. And in terms of the torturing environment, we can see an attack to physiological functions such as contextual manipulations, like inhuman conditions via like rotten and expired food, sleep dysregulation due to overcrowding, noises at night, fights, rats or snakes, and unhygienic conditions not only connected to the food, but also people getting sick for avoiding to drink or to eat in order to avoid the toilet system. And also we have reports of actions that produce fear, pain, hopelessness, that attack the need to belong, like incidents of police violence or being like testimonies of suicides in the informal settlements, the so-called jungles on the left and the right side of the camp. So the conclusion is that in this case, we can speak of a torturing environment. Can we do this also in the camp of that new camp? So people, what they do is they stress the environmental difference. Many describe it as well planned, well finished, but they all emphasize a carceral return, the camp being a prison and people being confined without their consent. We see the same colors as in the mapping of the old camps, yet we see new icons like of securitization. So while the old camp, remember, had also police and barbed wire and cameras, the new camp now has also drones. It has private security, G4S, which has also been named today. They operated detention center in Australia with torturing conditions. So orange is connected with unsafety with G4S as actors, the police, and purple with food. There's a big question mark because people did not know what happened or what would be happening in that huge part of the camp. Surprise, it turned out to be a detention camp that was used as a quarantine center, but then also as a camp in the camp for with the reports of arbitrary detention and possible deportation after. So is this too a torturing environment? Okay, first I'd like to share observations because what is happening is that supposed actions of care is reversed. So the promise of autonomy is hindered by being locked up, by being a prison. The functionality of infrastructure by its made dysfunctional. So like climatization, cooking stations, or no keys to lock containers. A veritable system of uncare is reported, mainly due to omissions when withdrawing from calling ambulances or hindering access to health care in cases of chronic diseases. Instead of information, there's not only a lack of information, but also arbitrariness. So like on curfew times, gate controls, and these are also penalized in case of non-compliance. So how can you comply if you don't even know the rule or if the rule changes arbitrarily? Okay, and sorry. And instead of safety, there is unsafety also due to securitization and excessive police and security violence. So, attacks on the basic human functions, we see hunger and also dehydration or thirst. Why? Because obviously people said that they received the same food that they had from the same company than they had received in the old camp before, which came like in packages like plastic bags, expired and moldy sometimes. They didn't receive any water. There was also water crisis during 1 or 2 days. So habitability was like there is a lack of privacy due to cameras and and no keys. And then there is maybe not, well, maybe the containers are better than before. There should be a video, but anyway, so due to massive rainfalls, the drainage system is not working. So people just get out of their container and fall into the water. And denial of medical treatment. So a person says sickness does not wait, health doesn't have a price. And where you don't have access to healthcare, it means risking death. So what we have is actions producing helplessness and hopelessness, with denying, for instance, access to health care, to psychological care. One person saying, okay, I asked for an appointment, but nobody wants to listen to my problems, my pain, nothing. And at that given moment, there is not even a camp doctor. So fear producing actions producing helplessness and hopelessness again, and pain producing actions due to police violence, which is reported like constantly if there are people who can report them. So we see systemic uncare that is like expressed clearly by residents. And yeah, now the question of how to theorize this, the systematic uncare on a global scale, where health intervention or non-intervention are used to harm people. What does this uncare? I mean, if care and reproduction normally is like in theory is coupled in feminist theory, what does uncare reproduce? And so I link it with necropolitical uncare, that is instead of biopolitical, that killing by inaction and letting people die by omission. So necropolitical scenarios do not only emerge in campsites, but along migration routes. So in the police massacre recently against migrants in Melilla, there have been ambulances at the spots, but they haven't been used to transport people to hospitals, but rather to transport dead bodies. Yeah, and so there, the contradictions of care and uncare also echo the feminist concerns that security politics are concern state security and even attack human safety. Beyond the camp, is it a system of deterrence? Because sometimes I ask myself, but if they try to really confine people and to make them to invisibilize they due to the remoteness, can we still speak of deterrence? And maybe we should look at digitalization. So how is it visibilized, for instance, via camera recording and then having live streams. There was a live stream of a so-called a live stream of people living in the camp on YouTube. So and then how to tackle this, how to contest uncare, a cliffhanger, look at the Pirate Care project, or come to our session, which is online today at night, so like the last one. And yeah, I think one answer and the only answer about how to achieve freedom of movement is abolition. So I think I don't have any more time, so thank you.
So, questions from the floor or certainly from online? Certainly, if anyone's online and would like to ask a question, otherwise we'll take any from the floor. Julia, yeah, go, Holly.
For the sorry, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, you mentioned the live stream at the end. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Do you see that as a way of contesting the uncaring conditions?
No, actually, it was rather the live stream was rather something the camp management did. It was just absurd. There's many absurdities around that camp and how it is managed. There was a live stream of a evacuation exercise with the case that you can see like the person who has killed themselves. And the exercise was, imagine there's a suicide in the camp and then people get just crazy and wild. And then imagine that you have to evacuate the camp and take certain corridors. And this exercise was kind of live streamed via Facebook. And imagine this is people people who fled violence, who have to be protected instead of exposed. And this is what they did. So exposing them on social media, on Facebook, and this is why I said maybe deterrence or being visible, hyper visible works differently from being remote, being invisibilized due to for public, but then hyper visible in a digital public sphere. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So interesting. I love the use of countermapping. In the second map of the new facility, it looked like 2 of the buildings were coded as spaces of security or safety. Did I read that correctly? And if so, why?
Just one. Yeah. So just this one here. This was a person. So I kind of aggregated all different mappings. So this was someone who said okay, in my own container right now I am with people that I like. So for now I feel safe, but there's other people who said I cannot have kind of healthy relationship with the people I live with because due to this XYZ, or also because of saying, okay, I feel depressive in here and I don't want to have any relationship with anyone. So yeah, thanks.
So those are housing units.
So this is container. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. That was fantastic, Julia. So interesting. And I'm really interested in the way you're taking up the idea of non-care through people like Indra's work, etc. And I just wondered if, you know, I think what that tells us is how sophisticated the state is getting at kind of producing these places as places of torture or punishment. Because I think maybe something, I'd like to hear your responses on this, of whether, you know, there's something else going on here, which is that it makes it much harder to hold states to account for torture. As you said earlier, it's not so much the public officials, it's the setting of the camp, but it's also that withdrawal of services, because if you're not doing anything, inverted commas, then how do you ensure that people are held accountable for that kind of just dehumanization and harm? But it also takes a lot of effort on the part of states to do that. So it's not actually like they're not doing anything. They're actually doing a lot to go to the trouble of withdrawing services and ensuring that people don't get care. So I wondered if you've thought about that in terms of responsibility and accountability and how that gets dispersed by the failure to act. You know what I mean?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Claire. I think the EU is like really doing a lot in order to be held accountable. So I don't know if you have followed the Frontex case, so that now it's out what activists since like for years, since probably the foundation of Frontex have dismantled is like, okay, Frontex as the EU border security institution, police, is committing violence against migrants and torture, and I think it's a preparation for also decades to come. So the hotspot system has been turned into something that is like more and more violent or deadly even. So Frontex, I mean, sorry, now it's a lot of excursions, right? But so Frontex cops, police officers, they destroyed, I think in the 2008 maybe, like all the wooden boats in the Mediterranean coast from Libya. So then people had to take the rubber boats, which are deadly, and we know that. So this is like, I think you can just see something if you really kind of genealogically follow the path through in history. And I think the EU also borrowed a lot of ideas from Australia. So remote detention, offshore detention, like has been a practice that harms people, and it has been shown. So yeah, and I think like this kind of uncare for me was okay, this is even more pervert than just not caring or to kind of, and I think, yeah, it's really, this distance of the camp is really hindering people to get there. There is still a kind of alternative activist camp, which is like 50, 100 meters away. People can walk there, but it's really, it's so hard to hold that camp up, this alternative structure. And also when the declaration was made that the camp would be moved, already many NGOs left the island. So that was kind of a massive, people leaving the island, and those who stayed back were like, okay, what is happening to us? And then again, there's a lot of police violence forever, but now it's also happening in the camp, and now no one can really talk about it because people can be confined within the camp and being penalized for that. So holding it, yeah, I mean, we have, as part of like the Samos Advocacy Collective, has published 2 reports on that, and trying to visualize it. And then there were members of the European Parliament coming to Samos, also connected to these reports. But for sure, like members of the left parties who are anyways kind of in favor of protecting human rights, and then you don't know if that changed anything for good, or if it just maybe hindered things getting worse. So in a way, I stay there with a huge question mark of how to counter it. And also in terms of economic interest, like system uncare and withdrawing Services, yes, but at the same time, it's still an immense economic interest in having G4S there and having all that security structure there. But I'm not good in generating hope anyway, so.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julia. We'll move on to our final speaker for this afternoon. And as I said, we may have a little time to come back as well, but I'd like to invite Manas Raturi from Belgrade University in Delhi to come and speak. Thank you so much for joining us today, Manas, and we'll hand over to you, and we should have your slides up. And plenty of time as well. Doing well.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Wonderful presentations. I'm terrible at making PowerPoints. It's very difficult to, your presentation was really interesting visibly. This is a terrible 4-slide presentation, very static. I'm going to read from the script because I tend to ramble a lot. But I'll start with, am I audible? Yeah. I'll start with admitting and acknowledging a crucial aspect of my work, which is in the context of some of the discussions that have taken place yesterday and in the domain of anti-carceral literature and activism, my work may seem to provide a counter-narrative, which is the struggle for incarceration. And so the title Freedom Through Incarceration was decided after much thought, since it points to a cruel irony in the lives of the people I've worked with for the last 3 years. Leprosy-affected people belonging to the rural heartlands of India who moved to Delhi, the national capital, in the hope of a better life, and the bereft of any state support, social, economic, or medical. So thus my work focuses on how over the years, leprosy-affected people have strategically chose detention and incarceration as a safety net for their otherwise precarious lives. But my intent here is to not romanticize, the forced choice, so to speak, one makes to incarcerate themselves. However, highlighting these stories allows us to construct a larger moral critique of the Indian welfare state, which compensate for the gaps in its leprosy rehabilitation policy through expanding the penal system. So to persuade you towards this argument, I start with the story of RK. In January of 2019, as the freezing winter in Delhi broke all its previous records, RK, a leprosy patient, walked in the corridors of the Delhi High Court. With the petition clutched in his hands, he recalled with horror the last 2 months of languishing on the streets of Delhi, struggling with the unbearable cold. This lawyer discussing with him the details of his petition, RK got ready to present his case to the judge, send him and 40 others back to the detention center in which they were incarcerated until 4 months ago, when the government decided to set them free. Now, with this demand, RK set stage for a renewed discourse on criminalization of disease and poverty in India. Standing in the court, he took stock of his life, spent navigating multiple layers of stigma, exile, abandonment, and extreme poverty to make a case for institution-based rehabilitation for leprosy care in India, which is sort of withering away with the new paradigm of community-based rehabilitation. RK was one of the many inmates who were released out of his home. His home was called the Home for Leprosy and Tuberculosis Affected Beggars. If I can move to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, his home was called the Home for Leprosy and Tuberculosis Affected Beggars, HLTB, a detention center functioning under the Bombay Prevention of Begging Act 1959, which was extended to Delhi in 1961, for arresting leprosy-affected people found begging in public spaces. Now, this act is remnant of the colonial vagrancy laws enforced in India during the British Raj. According to this act, the HLTB was meant to provide for the, and I quote, detention, training, and employment of beggars and their dependents. Now, what's interesting is, according to Section 2 of the Act, I'll just maybe. Yeah, this is the section of Bombay Act I'm talking about. If you read section 2 of the Act, begging covers activities such as singing, dancing, fortune telling, performing, offering any articles for sale, exposing any injury or disease, giving an impression of having no visible means of subsistence. Basically, one that the police or the local administration might ascribe to begging, any activity. And any person who fits this ambiguous and vague definition of begging can be arrested without a warrant by the police and sent for summary inquiry in a magistrate court. And if found guilty, the person is incarcerated in what the law calls a certified institution for a period ranging between 1 year to 3 years. And it's important to mention that within a year of its enforcement in Delhi, the police had rounded up close to 5,428 people under the provisions of the Bombay Act in Delhi. Now, this is not a standalone act. There are multiple versions of this act applicable in different states across India. And it's been rightly subject to fierce criticism for being in violation of the fundamental rights of the urban poor. A number of human rights activists have highlighted cases wherein this vague definition of begging has been used by the local administration to harass the urban poor and the homeless. There's a very specific example when the Commonwealth Games were held in Delhi in 2010. The police went around the city in these vans, arresting slum dwellers, arresting anyone who may even look like a beggar. And it was later found out, not just in Delhi, but also in Bombay, in Mumbai, that many of these were not beggars. They were people waiting for their trains. Someone was walking across the street, and they were basically, arrested and detained in these institutions with without warrant, without any legal representation of sorts. So the criticism of this act is well-intentioned. Finally, in August 2018, the Delhi High Court struck down several provisions of the Bombay Prevention of Begging Act. In Delhi is violative of the Indian Constitution, and the High Court judgment was met with praise and welcome. And also with the judgment, all the prosecutions which were made under this act were struck down. What happens in the HLTB in Delhi is that they start phasing the inmates out, releasing them, quote unquote, and they're set free only to languish on the streets, enveloped in the bitter cold of Delhi's winters. So in my conversations with people, what they say is that this is not the freedom we desired. We know that if we die inside HLTB, there will be people to mourn, carry our lifeless bodies, and pray for our souls. But if we die on the streets, we die alone. Now, it was this concern with what freedom and incarceration means to now former inmates is what drew me to my work. In 2019, I began my conversations with former inmates of the HLTB who'd been released by the Delhi government after the 2018 High Court judgment. And the narratives led me to a story which was bigger than that of the HLTB itself, of how these inmates had voluntarily engaged in a cycle of arrest and incarceration to secure state support inside the leprosy home. And in the cycle, the inmates had formed affective ties that allowed them to cope with the loss of family and community ties back in their villages. Almost using statecraft against itself, as the law calls them lepers, strategically utilized the Delhi's beggary law, built specifically to discourage beggars with leprosy from entering into Delhi, to gradually build better lives for themselves. Their stories, they allow us to relook at the image of incarceration as this totalizing image is inescapably destructive to its inmates. And this is a conceptual leaf I borrow out of literature on how vulnerable populations come to consider incarceration as a care of last resort, which is a concept. There's a very interesting concept called jail care by Carolyn Suffren. We don't have the time to get into that. I'm sorry, I lost track. Yeah. So what makes an individual afflicted with leprosy beg in India? The leprosy is a chronic infection caused by the acid-fast bacillus mycobacterium leprae, which, if left untreated, can cause skin lesions or worse, organ thickening in the affected part of the body. And for centuries, especially in India and other countries such as Brazil, these bodily manifestations have formed the basis for severe social discrimination against people with leprosy, with misinformed fears around contagion and disability. And in parts of rural India, where healthcare access is minimal, leprosy is either diagnosed too late or simply hidden for fear of stigma or worse, social boycott. So even before they're medically diagnosed, participants tell that even before they're medically diagnosed, leprosy happens to strike at the very center of concerns around the reproduction of the family unit. So since one fear is that the family has to struggle with what government has called courtesy stigma, so the family has to engage in a slew of measures to basically not let the village know that there's a person in this house with leprosy. Don't have time to go into the specifics, but what the men then basically do, and I can address the gender bias in this analysis. What the men do is they choose to leave their family. And they choose to travel far away from the village. Delhi happens to be the national capital. It's an aspirational place to be for someone who has had to abandon the family and all severe ties to basically protect the family. So, one very common concern amongst families with someone who has leprosy, that nobody would marry into a family. So, the fear that the family unit won't be able to reproduce, the clan won't move forward, the vansh, as they call it in Hindi. That's a very strong concern. When they reach hospitals, which they think is the only place where they'll get like 2 square meals a day and medical treatment, what the medical system, how it approaches leprosy is that it hyper focuses on the bacterium in the body. And leprosy has an afterlife. So as one participant says, even when the bacteria dies, leprosy lives. Now, what the medical institution does is that it valorizes the bacteria and it overlooks the afterlife. So once people are declared leprosy free biologically, medically, they're left out on the streets again. And this, is in the context of the hospitals themselves struggling with the lack of beds, lack of government funds, etc. Now, it is here that the detention center comes into the picture. Over the years, leprosy patients had built informal networks through which they disseminated information about this one place in Delhi you could go for free food and medicine, the HLTB. All they had to do was take a train to Delhi, get to Connaught Place, which is a business center in Delhi, which houses multiple religious sites, a Hindu temple, a Gurudwara, a mosque, church. So the plan used to be to sit in front of any of these sites each Saturday. A policeman would patrol the area, catch you, send you to a judge. The judge will sentence you to a detention. And once a sentence ends, you go back to the same place and you beg again, and you constantly repeat the cycle. Do I have about a minute? 3 minutes. Oh, okay. Great. An example of deep entanglements between the welfare and the penal state, the HLTB was structurally combined practices of care and incarceration, but I wish I had time to go into that. It was a place for medical treatment, but also of surveillance. So these are the rules that were formulated when the Delhi administration adopted the Bombay Act in 1960. This is essentially a disciplinary code of conduct. If you don't follow this, you're liable to be punished. So it was a place to render the inmates immobile, but also to prevent further influx of beggars afflicted with leprosy in Delhi. And this the detention center is tucked away on the fringes of Northeast Delhi. It's presently connected to the other areas of the city, but it's described by the early inmates as a jungle. When they came to Delhi, a place which nobody wanted to visit. So later construction work saw them discovering skeletal remains, which were dug up. So, they later realized it was built on a burial ground. And it was run by like, a medical superintendent. The inmates were provided with dry food, dry ration. They had to cook by themselves. They had to collect firewood from the forest nearby. But they were given other essentials. Yet the HLTB achieved more than its disciplinary and punitive intent. It was consistently produced and reproduced by its inmates through forming closer associations based on shared histories of stigma, discrimination, and abject poverty, to recreate a broken identity into a collectivizing force. Over the years, the inmates had built samitis, which are committees to manage day-to-day functioning of the HLTB. So assessing the quality of the food that the government gives them, deliberating on modes of action to demand from the government better food and increase in financial assistance. Through strengthening political action, the inmates also built relations with local political leaders, so be it unelected party strongmen in the area of the Indian National Congress, be it the municipal councillor, even be it the minister in the Delhi government. So it provided them with a place to be and belong. And it's constantly remembered and emphasized. This aspect of the HLTB is constantly remembered and emphasized among former inmates. So, I mean, the larger idea is to highlight the travesty that is leprosy rehabilitation in India. We've come quite a long way. I must admit that most of these narratives are from people who came into Delhi in the 1970s, 1980s, when leprosy control was not as holistic as it is at the moment, and the stigma has faded away. The government has done, the government runs a national leprosy eradication program. Ironically, India is leprosy free. It was declared leprosy free in 2005. But it continues to report new cases, which points to a limitation of the program itself and how it hyper focuses on the World Health Organization's target of the prevalence rated targets, which is one detected case per 10,000 people, and this need for hospitals to constantly clean their registers. So as fast as we can declare someone leprosy free, we'll be able to achieve that target. And that's how that's the framework around which leprosy eradication in India works. So I'll stop here, and I hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you.
Okay, so that was wonderful, perfectly on time. We've got plenty of time for questions. Please jump in.
It's such an incredibly powerful contradiction of the way in which people seek incarceration. It's not all surprising, I mean, my work is in the United States, where people who face lack of shelter want to go back into incarceration, not because they value incarceration, but because at least they have that's the only place they can get a safety net. Now, and India is notable by the fact that there are no safety nets, no health insurance safety nets, no old age pensions and all kinds of. So it's a profound statement on the society itself that the one safe place that people can find themselves. So, and my own circumstances. I lived in Australia for 26 years, and now the last 22 years in the United States. But before that, first 22 years of my life was mostly in India, and so I know what leprosy looks like. And my father was a physician working with people who were leprosy affected. But the disturbing element in all of this is that people who grew up in India are enculturated into understanding that begging is blaming the victim really for People call me from all parts of the world. They don't know where I am. I mean, I think we blame the victim. We blame people for getting leprosy. It's disturbing, and I'm wondering if you can, apart from the meta stuff that you've been talking about, give us a really kind of a human picture of the proximity issues, what's happening in there with people who are leprosy affected. How do they see family structures or affiliate structures within the prison itself? Because most of them, as you know, are outcasts and cast out by their own families and their own societies. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the location, the geography, so to speak, the human geography of the incarcerated facility where people leprosy affected are. And thank you for your really, really, really wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'll be able to speak on the human geography. Not a geographer by training, but since you mentioned the specifics, the two parts in which people live their lives, leprosy affected people. One is in the village where they come from, and I speak specifically about the village, and because I don't want to talk about the villages like an isolated, regressive place, but from the narratives which come out of people in the HLTB, the village is a place to escape after you get diagnosed, because like you mentioned, specifics, families, what they try to do is to hide the person. So it's a physical restriction on their mobility. You can't access the public pond. You can't go out. I mean, you can't, smoke a cigarette with your friends. Your friends don't share their cigarettes with you. And that happens even before the diagnosis, because, locally people know what constitutes leprosy. They're not invited to weddings. They're not invited to one aspect that I haven't really fleshed out is that, and that's very interesting, and that dents my narrative somewhere, is when people from the upper castes get leprosy, they're very ashamed of being treated like untouchables people from the lower castes. So there's several ways in which people think of the villages and, ironically imprisoning. Like I said, there's a fear that, oh, my family would die because of me, literally die, because nobody would marry into a family. So a family would end, like a lineage won't continue, like so that is, I can keep on talking about the specific ways in which it manifests. You go to a shop, they wouldn't offer you, your change back. In the worst case scenario, people throw boiling water at you. That is one. When you move to the city, you're essentially choosing urban precarity over that, discrimination faced in the village. But it's also emancipating in a way. One reason why people, I didn't talk about the states from which people come to Delhi, but that's Maharashtra, West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, far away from Delhi. Far away. Far away from Delhi, but they choose to travel that far, and they choose urban precarity because it gives them a sense of anonymity. And once they get anonymity, in Delhi, they can, they prefer choosing that life over, like the neighbor knowing that, oh, I have leprosy, and, my family has leprosy. The HLTB in particular, I can speak of the physical geography. It's situated on the northeast side of Delhi. It's the periphery. It's the border between Delhi and Uttar Pradesh. Now it's, several neighborhoods have come up, but when they were moved and the HLTB was set there, it was an abandoned, fringe of the capital. and slowly, I mean, one thing that I wanted to highlight was that care in HLTB, I didn't address the care aspect of it. Care was achieved through agentic practices, through building building political ties with political leaders, through building like self-appointed committees, etc. And that is one way in which people also cope with the loss of biological ties, with the loss of their family. I don't know if I answered your question well, but
So time for more questions.
So I was just wondering if, I don't think you touched on this if I missed it, but are there any groups or civil society organizations that are working on alternate forms of accommodation for people with leprosy or people recovered from leprosy? And I guess what is the role of civil society here? Is that something that you've looked at?
so civil society organizations have been working in different leprosy colonies in India, not specifically around issues of accommodation, but to provide them with, say, services. So, running water, electricity. The very idea of why there are segregated leprosy colonies and detention centers in India is sort of accepted as the norm, even by civil society organizations, that okay, it's there now, what we can do. So one way in which civil society organizations engaged with the question of accommodation, at least, was through criticizing the beggary law. But what happened as a result of that was, it was a complete, I happened to write on, I wrote 2 pieces welcoming the Delhi High Court's judgment, because, it mentions the fact that through this law, you demonize the victim. The civil society organizations were very active. You have the People's Union of Civil Liberty, you have different, activists working in their own right, talking about how we need to repeal all these anti-beggary laws across states in India. That's where, I think that's where there's a certain there's a certain, we need to assess it with more nuance when we talk about decriminalization begging in India, because it very particularly, like I said, people have now started using it strategically to get access to state services. But I think civil society organizations in India lack the framework through which they can talk about accommodation, because right now the whole problem is like, okay, you decriminalize begging, you open shelter homes. Should be another form of, another form of like, curtailment, and I don't want to call it incarceration, but I don't agree with the broad brush stroke through which civil society organizations in India talk about decriminalizing begging. Accommodation, we'll give them shelter homes, we'll give them, we'll open camps, etc. It's slightly disturbing. So yeah, hope that's the question.
Yeah.
So we're more or less running towards the end of our session, but a chance also, of course, questions for Julia and Jess as well, if anything else has popped up. Any more questions on them? Yeah, go for it, Claire. No, there's no need for responses.
Really amazing. Just a question for you, Minister. It kind of builds on what Andre was just saying. I think that what you're arguing is actually exactly the same as what we heard this morning, which is that what we're looking for is a society where those supports are. So, and I had another question that I was just brain dead. What is going on? But yeah, so it's, oh yeah, you were talking about decriminalisation of begging, and I think it speaks to the same sorts of issue, which is that you take something away, but what do you have in its place? So if you take these leprosy homes or forms of incarceration away, what is in its place to support people who are suffering from leprosy? Similarly, if you decriminalize begging and people have nowhere to go, and I'm reminded of kind of some of the debates around eradicating child labour. So you eradicate child labour, that's really important, but it can have a huge impact on families where they have no other means of support. So these questions and these actions that seem unproblematic often to Western advocacy organisations in particular on the ground just don't work the same way as they would in the West, say, or some parts of, you know, I'm not saying the West has got it all. Yeah, I think, have you seen my point?
Yeah. After the Delhi High Court judgment, which decriminalized begging, there were several efforts by civil society organizations to also address your point to, you know, decriminalize it in other states. But then it leaves a vacuum. And, you know, we forget that the reason why they exist, these detention centers exist, I mean, it's a travesty, but they exist because of lack of, you know, state support in other areas. So, yeah, I mean, what do we create after taking that away? And sadly, we didn't think of that question. And I say we because, you know, I myself was uncomfortable when I was talking to people, and they said that, you know, that what do we do now that, you know, we're left on the streets? So it's a very, I don't know, if I should use the term, it's a very short-sighted approach, eradicating something before creating something new. And the government has been sitting on, the union government in India has been sitting on a draft bill on, you know, they call it persons of in destitution bill. And the idea is basically that we'll open like shelter homes, we'll get them IDs, will, you know, there'll be, but it still takes the definition of begging as that ambiguous definition and the vague definition and in the Bombay Act. So yeah, there is a vacuum, and given that the medical you know, medical system in India, so to speak, you know, valorizes the bacteria. It doesn't. I mean, you know, as one of my supervisors, he always says that when we, I'm from sociology, and when we talk about medicine, we create this binary between the sociologists would study the social and the medicine would study the hospitals and the institutions. But what's also important as, say, non-doctors or whatever, is that we also question the medical framework, which hyper-focuses on the body as, you know, as the site of treatment, as the site of rehabilitation. And rehabilitation essentially means you kill the bacteria through a multi-drug regime, and then you forget about the person. So you leave the person, like, you know, on their own. So yeah, now I'm rambling, but essentially, yeah, there's a vacuum that needs to be filled.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. If we could all join in thanking our panelists for today. Thank you so much for the tech support. That made my life very easy. Thank you.